of our work and teaching. And I really must thank FMES for initiating this webinar series and inviting us to come on board. So in the 2.5 years, that we've been in a public health emergency, COVID-19 disrupted life in more ways than we were prepared for. And the effects of the pandemic and the related lockdown are still being experienced, and particularly keenly by the most marginalized sections of society. Breakdowns happened on multiple fronts, exposing the flaws in health infrastructures, the total absence of social support mechanisms, gaps in both health and economic policy, and of course, the almost complete mismanagement of communication and information mechanisms. In a context of uncertainty, when everyone was seeking reassurance and direction, and what was required was transparency and trust, what we instead got was a false certainty and bravado on the one hand, and obfuscation and stonewalling on the other. Journalists and other public communicators attempted to step in to bridge the information gap to some degree, performing the dual role, often very admirably, of providing news that people could use and holding public institutions and systems to account. The past 2 years have passed in a mad scramble to keep up with changing science, with shifting policy, with unforeseen and therefore unplanned for humanitarian crises, and with chaotic information and communication systems. Fake news and misinformation, particularly in relation to treatment protocols and the vaccines, became familiar tropes in the public discourse. And everyone was blamed for this massive communication failure: government, media, the internet, even our neighbors and families on WhatsApp. So even though we're still coping with the ripple effects of this most recent public health emergency, we're now at a point where we can engage in critical reflection that can help us take some lessons from things that went wrong and things that went right. This brings us to the theme of today's roundtable, convened with a view to training a reflective eye on our recent experiences and to attempt to find a way through the communication chaos. What is the role of journalists and health communicators in such situations? How do they evolve mechanisms of reportage and fact-checking that not only hold public institutions to account, but also include a consciousness of how policies and programs impact the most marginalized sections of society? What questions can they raise so that policymakers and public functionaries keep those on the margins in mind as they design responses? How do they balance clarity with urgency? We have with us 4 individuals who represent a diverse set of views and locations. One of them, of course, could not join today, so we have 4. We were supposed to have 5. She had a family emergency, but Panjot will join us in the next roundtable. So we're hoping that our participants can raise further questions, address the questions that I've very briefly talked about. And now I'd like to ask Sandhya to introduce them and invite them to share their thoughts.
Okay, so our first speaker will be Sayantan Datta. Sayantan is a genderqueer science journalist and a writer of The Life of Science, which is a science platform, science media platform looking at stories of scientific pursuit as they intersect with various societal barriers in India. Then we have Menka Rao, currently with Suno India, a podcast platform. Menka has been covering health for more than 15 years, and one aspect of this has been gender rights, one aspect. Menka has done a substantial amount of reporting through the pandemic. Our third speaker is Murad Banaji, who's a mathematician. And Murad has used numbers and data to make sense of what's happening during the pandemic, and including also looking at the official numbers and making other calculations. And his estimates have been met with much pushback from some quarters. I think it's worth talking about how to deal with that. And our fourth speaker is B.R. Shamanna. He's a public health epidemiologist who's been studying how various vulnerable groups have been impacted by the pandemic. Please read more about them on our websites, and you can also follow them on Twitter because they do have much to say. Now I invite each of the panelists to make short introductory remarks of 5 to 8 minutes, addressing some of the questions that Usha has highlighted, and to speak from their specific vantage point, following which we'll have a moderate discussion amongst the 4 of you, and also then take questions from the audience. So we'll go in the following order. We'll start with Sayantan. Sayantan, would you like to set the ball rolling?
Absolutely. So thank you for the introduction, Sandhya, and to Usha for setting the context out so well. Um, because I've been asked to speak first, I just want to sort of locate this discussion a little further in how I approach the question of public health emergency and a crisis. And let me begin by saying that the recent COVID-19 pandemic was sort of a spike in a public health emergency that we've been inhabiting for decades. And although I myself did not report as much on COVID-19, I have reported significantly on the ongoing monkeypox pandemic and the HIV/AIDS pandemic, sort of reflecting back on the HIV/AIDS pandemic and doing alternative historiographies. And from there, a couple of things emerge for me as important as journalists that I must lay out, and then I'm happy to hear from my colleagues here. So one is that when it comes to a public health emergency, I think our imagination of what a journalist is supposed to do is restricted to a very unidirectional flow of information, where there's this idea of an expert who's a scientist, somebody from the government, somebody who's making policy, and or somebody who is developing vaccines, right? So basically a public health expert, a scientist, a policymaker, and somebody from the government are our ideas of experts. And the information, as journalists, we are sort of often prone to expository work where we take the kind of information that experts are generating and sort of putting it out to quote unquote lay people to sort of help them understand and make sense of the emergency that's going around. I think while that work is extremely important, it's also important for us as journalists to think about how to do the vice versa. How does one take how people are making sense, how people who are not directly in the ecosystem of public health, of science, of policy making and government, how are they making sense of the pandemic, or public health emergencies, how are they being affected? Especially from the vulnerable groups, and see if we can locate our stories in the stories that are on the ground out there. For me, it's also important to think about how we think of public health emergencies as discrete events, right? So the COVID-19, people would think of it as starting somewhere in early 2020, and now the sort of the vibe around COVID-19 has ended. People are not as excited to talk about it as they were earlier. But in a country like India, where the public health infrastructure is being torn apart with each passing day, and health has been one of the axes through which active marginalization of people has happened. So, examples that come to my mind: the women's health emergencies during the Indira Gandhi emergency, 1975 to 1977, then early 1990s and early 2000s, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, COVID-19, then monkeypox, and you have malaria, tuberculosis, and dengue on the background. So then it's very important for us to constantly think of these emergencies not as discrete events, but as spikes in what is an otherwise deeply embedded social and political context. And it's important for us to constantly also think about, and we can talk more about how one can do that, but think about how do we locate these crises in these social and political realities, but also think about how these emergencies create new social and political realities. That transition for us to think about is very important. I think I'll take a pause there, and I'll be happy to hear more from others and then comment further, if that's okay.
Okay. Thanks, Sayantan. I think it's very important that you make the first distinction, which is that we're not talking only about science communication. We're talking about journalism, which is interactive, and which also has a different kind of responsibility in terms of responsibilities to readers. And second, to talk about the fact that this is not an emergency. It is a spike in a kind of a continuing emergency, which is the emergency of health and healthcare. Menka, would you like to sort of take up from where Sayantan started?
Yeah, so I mean, I was thinking about how we can frame it 3 years after the pandemic. And I was thinking that it's also because we journalists, as much as, the administrators and policymakers, we like to look at stories with resolutions and, like there's an end game to it. But unfortunately, with health and disease, there is no end game at sight, like as Sayatan said, there are only spikes in a ongoing sort of public emergency of different sorts, depending on the season and depending on the location and depending on the population, etc. So I think the first mistake that we did was we looked at COVID as a finite problem, and later we started even like classifying it as waves. Like, okay, once the waves like dips, then then we can relax. But we cannot portray any pandemic as like, I mean, as if there's an end game at sight. And I think because we were so attracted to that narrative, we either like sort of created panic, like we were okay with people being sprayed with DDT, or as Sayanta said, like people pregnant women being sent back, or they were all sort of seen as collateral damage, the vaccination program completely falling apart in those few months, or the TB program, or people not getting abortion. I mean, it's a matter of life and death for many of these people, right? And now I'm working on this series related to blood, and how blood availability is so affected. It affects people's lives. So we cannot look at these as collateral damage anymore. And because now we have the power of hindsight, we have to be able to give as much, as journalists also, as much attention to these problems, and not just have this tinge of regret ki, oh, that woman didn't get services or whatever, or that woman died on the way to hospital, etc. It's not on. I think the tone mattered, and we sort of concurred with the government sort of viewpoint on it. And that I think I take I don't think that's a right way of doing health journalism, because we need to take not just one emergency, that is COVID, but as a new virus, but even other kinds of emergency quite seriously. And because of this idea that this can end at some point, because all of us, we know that this is probably the first time that people who are reporting on politics and crime, etc., they were reporting on health, COVID, right? So they were also like, everybody became very keen to oversell a technology, and that we saw in vaccines. I wish Banjot was here, because she could have probably talked about that more. We thought that we now know that there is only evidence that it reduces severe disease, but it doesn't prevent infections. But we did not communicate these disclaimers even after we knew it quite well. I personally don't think that this is known to everyone, that this can prevent disease, or the understanding that what vaccination does is not clear to people. COVID vaccination, and under no circumstances is it ethical to make these vaccines quote unquote compulsory. That is for sure. Again, because we again believe in this end game business, we don't have a clear policy on masks right now. So we don't really know like why in airports people are not using it. I mean, just it doesn't make any sense. We don't have an idea about how to be safe, basically, like even after this media whatever circus has ended. The breaking news model does not work for pandemics, is what I mean. You can at most make an announcement, or if there is like a sudden, I don't know, like a delta wave. I mean, that delta wave probably, the oxygen shortage. I mean, those kind of things we can announce, so to speak. But otherwise, health reporting is often slow, considered. Every story like has so many contours to it. Like even vaccines being approved had so many issues. Like there was not enough evidence at that point, etc., etc. So that we have to, even newspapers, I feel, lacked that particular degree of reporting, I feel. And it's people like Banjot, and they are the ones who sort of fill the gap. So this explainer model has to be embraced I feel, by lots of other media houses too. And, not just probably in, I don't have much expertise in the form, but, maybe in different kinds of form, like audio, video, etc. But, we need to be open to reporting, which is not just breaking news sort, especially for health reporting. And going back to what Sayantan said, we have to learn from other pandemics. Like it seemed like only the older journalists knew what happened during the HIV. We don't seem to have any idea about public health stigma. Like it's not much needs to be said about the stigma created against poor people, and like it's the Tablighi Jamaat incident. It's an endless list. But I think what we need to communicate is not that it's not just an ethical issue, this blaming people for a disease, but it does not work in stemming a public health crisis. I think that probably is not clear. Like, it's not just a question of morals here, it actually doesn't work. Like, you blame people for a disease, it doesn't work. Like nothing good comes of it, short term or long term. I think this 3 years into the pandemic, we've also failed to recognize what happens after the disease. And particularly, like, because I've recently done a series on long COVID, and I'm referring to that. It's also called post-COVID condition. WHO calls it the post-COVID condition. And this is post-viral illnesses is not new. We've seen it after SARS-CoV-1, dengue. What I think, we are so keen to find we are so keen for a resolution that we do not want to like go back to, people with disabilities after the virus. And, I have only seen like one-off stories here and there, but, we are not demanding anything from the state in relation to such as big a problem as long COVID. And I think that is a failing. Now 3 years, right? So first year we can forgive that, they didn't understand what's happening. Second year you can like sort of, but now it's been 3 years. So, we don't have like a sense of, we only have modeled estimates. We don't have a sense of how many people have this problem. We don't have a sense of how many people are unemployed because of long COVID. The only people we seem to find who have this problem are people who live in apartments. I have personally not found like anyone, who is like a poor person who has this problem. First, I know of them, but I have not found anyone to sit and interview, right? So these are like real issues, and we need to like do some focus reporting on this also. Like we need to focus on the disability that a new wave of virus can cause. And I think that, I'll end it there.
Sandhya, should we move on to?
Yeah. Thanks, Meeta.
Yeah.
That was a great sort of overall perspective on the various issues I think the journalists have to face and have to look back on. And I think Murad is an expert of a different kind, from a different perspective, can actually comment on, for example, Menka's comments about the estimates, which I think you're most well known for, and the debate in that. And first of all, if you can describe how your estimates were received and how journalists were able to use that or even critique that. Go ahead, Murad.
Thank you very much, Sandhya, and thank you for inviting me to speak. Oh.
Volume.
Oh, is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me to this really interesting event, and an event which focuses on something which is rarely focused on, I think, which is going beyond actually the public health science to the public health communication, and that key question about how do we talk about public health, how do we talk about data, how do we talk about science in a way which is accessible and which is honest, let's say. And I suppose my opening remarks will be based on my own experiences. They'll be quite personal, and my own experience being fairly obsessed with COVID over a period of about 18 months, starting in early 2020. I'm kind of a little bit more distanced from it now, but there was a period of time when, I kind of read all the literature and I tried to engage very actively with COVID. And obviously I wrote quite a lot And that included, as you mentioned, making quite a number of estimates, trying to understand at the level of what's happening with infections, what was happening with mortality, and then in fact an increasing focus on mortality as time went on. So I thought the first two speakers gave a really nice summary of some of the main issues, which I too felt arose during this process. So, so first of all, okay, so this was a learning experience for everyone. And I think we have to look back at the whole kind of pandemic and the form that journalism took and how scientists communicated, bearing in mind that it was a learning experience. And it was a learning experience which was very complex in many ways. And in a way, I'm addressing my comments to people who engaged with the pandemic in good faith, because I think I want to distinguish the people who engaged with in good faith, but perhaps didn't always get things right, from people who, you know, were actively spreading bigotry or had a particular propaganda line or role to play. So it was a complex event, obviously scientifically very complex. Knowledge was evolving. I think it was also a politically complex event in the sense that there was a lot at stake at, say, local government level. There was a lot at stake kind of at national level. It was obviously complex in terms of the kind of human stories which were unfolding during this. How do you report on those human stories? And I don't think it was an easy time to be a health reporter or a data journalist looking at these questions, because there were so many different missteps that you could make. I mean, you had to coax meaning from all of this very complicated data, and the data itself was coming out of very complicated processes. You had to try to communicate about uncertainty, and I think communicating about uncertainty doesn't always go with making a good story. I mean, if you're always hedging your bets, you're always saying, well, probably this is what's happening. That doesn't necessarily read very well, not as well as saying, well, this is what's happening with more confidence. And obviously you had to also sensitively tell human stories, because you're talking about a lot of suffering here, suffering caused both by the pandemic and by responses to the pandemic. And you have to sensitively tell those stories. And I think that's actually one count on which journalists fared very, very well, at least in the alternative media, at telling those stories. And then, of course, there was this two-way communication between scientists and journalists, or between other so-called experts and journalists, which I think actually was a really fruitful process for everybody involved. Anyway, it's very hard to summarize some of the many things I feel I learned through this process. So I'll just kind of mention a couple and hopefully be able to raise more during the discussion. I mean, one of the things that I felt was an early kind of learning point was that taking a very, let's call it technocratic approach to what was happening was going to be not very fruitful. It was going to be a mistake. And what do I mean by that? I mean an approach which kind of starts with the aphorism, let the data speak for itself, which I think is an absolutely nonsensical thing to say, but I do feel that it's a deeply held belief in a lot of people that it's a meaningful thing to say, that you can let the data speak for itself. And if you look at the kind of pandemic data, which was coming out of these very complex processes, I mean, processes which involved, you know, who and why do people get tested, whose deaths get recorded as COVID deaths and whose don't, you know, processes which involved society in very kind of complicated ways and psychology as well. And then saying, okay, we can construct simple stories out of that. I think that was a process which was bound to fail. You had to delve deeper. So you had to delve deeper, both into what was going on behind the data. And that's one kind of key role that journalists played, because they told us about where does this data come from? What are the processes by which we get this data? And also you had to delve deeper, you know, within the data itself. If you were a data scientist, you had to look at the data more locally, for example, kind of try to break it down, or look wider, widen your field of view, look internationally and say, well, how does what's happening in India compared to what's happening elsewhere? And are there some contradictions that we find when we focus in or we focus out? And these are the things which are likely most important to explore. So I think that was a kind of real important process, that you have to kind of look deeper, just not take the given data streams at face value. And I suppose what I'm saying is that you needed to learn to be skeptical. And that included, of course, being skeptical of the official line on a number of different aspects of the pandemic, skeptical of official pronouncements about what was happening, about how much infection had spread, about how many people were dying and so forth. And skepticism, of course, is a key part of trying to unpack something like a pandemic, especially in India. Of course, you don't kind of build these stories and build an understanding in an ethical and a contextual vacuum. So not only are you trying to understand the processes, but you're also trying to understand the ethics and the kind of purpose of the communication. You're saying, well, what are you trying to communicate about, and where am I positioned in this whole system in order to be able to communicate about it? You know, if I'm sitting in a building society here, am I actually able to understand what's going on in the slums in my own city? Am I able to see, is there another side to this story that perhaps is completely removed from my own experience? And being able to actually position yourself and ask these questions about ethics and about inequality was a kind of crucially important part of unpacking the pandemic, I feel, and something that, you know, was a kind of learning along the way. And I suppose that brings me to my last point of this kind of introduction, which is one of the things it clearly foregrounded was that we need to have honest conversations about marginalization and inequality if we're talking about public health. It was all very well to just present these raw numbers, but we didn't know, you know, what were the caste of the people who were dying, what were the religions of the people who were getting infected, how many of these people were, you know, what were their gender identities, in what other ways might they have been marginalized. It was as though that was all brushed under the carpet in official data, and to a large extent, we still know very little about that, and that's a story which still needs to be kind of unpacked and told fully. And obviously, all of those points go beyond COVID-19. They go towards going to the general kind of discussion around public health, that we need to be honest about unpacking the effects of marginalization and inequality on, you know, what happens in an emergency such as this. And I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Murad. So our last speaker.
Shall I go ahead, Sandhya?
Yes, please. Shamana, please go ahead.
Thanks very much to my previous speakers, and I'll probably give a very, sort of chronicle what happened within the country with respect to COVID-19 per se. And like they say, you know, we are wise in hindsight. I'm not going to be judgmental in terms of how things happened, how things were reported, and what was communicated. So I'll keep that aside. But just to let you know that, a couple of dates were very important in our journey in COVID-19. If you looked at it, I think the first time we got a hint of COVID-19 within the country was January 29th, when the first RT-PCR test became positive, and it was reported by National Institute of Virology. If I put myself in the shoes of the director there and try and communicate, because this has a lot of repercussions in terms of the virus entering into the country and next trajectory in terms of how it's going to be spread. But would you report it as COVID has finally entered India? Because it was based on an RT-PCR result per se. Following which they were able to identify or isolate the virus only in the month of March. That's when basically we, sort of follow-up actions came into picture. And this was very critical from the point of view of communication and ethical communication at the policy level, in terms of saying that it's confirmed now that we have been able to isolate whatever the variant is or the strain is, and this is truly SARS-CoV-2 within the country. That happened only in March. So from January to March, this was what the follow-up action with respect to COVID-19 happened. Following which was when actually the whole issue of Janta curfew, which was a sort of rehash or a rehearsal for about 14 hours on one of the days, and then a 68 days of total sort of complete lockdown with respect to the whole the country being locked out. And the lockdown was very harsh, and probably one of the harshest lockdowns which has been reported in literature as well, or literature, leave alone literature, across the whole sort of all the countries put together. So, it was very important that, you're talking to, 130 crore people or 1.3 billion people, and, you're getting to make sure that they also lock themselves up. And that was very, very critical in terms of thing. In hindsight, like I said, was it a good idea to box the virus or box the people rather than boxing the virus? So, like I said, now we know that for sure that it was not a very wise thing to, lock the people or block, sort of box the people, rather than we should have been looking at boxing the virus. Like I said, those were things which happened very newly to all of us, and we didn't know. And uh, that followed the whole episode with respect to developing medications, different regimens, the vaccines, and the controversies surrounding the vaccines with respect to emergency use authorization, as well as whether it is interim emergency use authorization or vaccines used in clinical trial form, etc. I think a lot of confusion which happened with respect to that, but be that as it may, because I think over a period of 9 months or 12 months, we demonstrated that we could cover a large number of people with respect to vaccines, irrespective of whether some people willingly took the vaccine or some people did not. So I'm not going to be judgmental there as well. The whole other thing which happened, and I think this was the crux of the problem, was with respect to reporting. And I think Murad already mentioned with respect to the data and being dependent on data and the models going haywire, etc. That was something which nobody could get a handle on. Which model do you believe? Which communication do you believe? So are we dealing with infodemic in addition to a pandemic is something which, all of us were exposed to. And again, I think it became a double whammy in terms of trying to deal with this news, which basically was not sort of verified news, or you could call it news which led to a lot of panic and sensationalism, rather than basically trying to help people like, David Nabarro, who advised the Director General of the WHO, says that it was to do with saving lives, bringing back livelihoods, and then living in the new normal. That's precisely what's been the trajectory of the COVID-19 as we speak today. And living in the new normal means dealing with things like long COVID, etc., which we are beginning to understand much more deeply. So we had this issue with respect to the infodemic and the whole issue surrounding, would you call it a booster dose or would you call it a precautionary dose? Even till date, people think that the third dose of the vaccine which you take is called as a booster dose. It doesn't boost anything. If you ask me, I can tell you that it was more of a deterrent rather than, or more of a sort of, putting it plainly, sometimes I would say that it's like a placebo which is given, or it's more in terms of the realm of precautionary in order to prevent newer variants from entering into your body and causing things. So I did think that there were issues with respect to how we communicated at whatever levels, and also in terms of really dealing with this problem of the impact of such kind of instances which happen. My previous speakers, Menika especially talked about the deaths and the number of deaths and how we were saying, did we report properly, etc. And on the hindsight, on the other side, if you look at it, a state like Kerala probably reported each and every case they detected and each and every death which happened there, showing up as one of the states which is small, but we're not the states which seem to have a bigger problem compared to the other states. That's because of proper reporting which happened in Kerala, which helped a lot of modeling also to happen. And an offshoot of that is a model which, the Sutra model, as I've been going through something called as the Sutra model, which seems to mimic very clearly the numbers as well as the model figures, at least till date. Again, the model is as good as the data, as they say, but it was also related to, sane in the public domain, if I wanted to do a research or if I wanted to do some studies, did I have access to that data? And unfortunately, even at the national level, you had people who were technocrats doing the communication rather than an organization like, say, for instance, the National Center for Disease Control, which had a very important role to play in the integrated disease surveillance project, but practically did nothing when it came to COVID-19. And that's a criticism I have, and probably, I openly say it in terms of the whole aspect related to COVID-19. What's also struck me is the fact that now we are looking at the pandemic moving to an endemic. And when does that happen? We also had problems with respect to describing whether it was a cluster related spread, whether it was a community transmission. What will happen if you say community transmission? What will happen if you say it's restricted to a cluster? So all those issues did happen. And lastly, I just want to end this introduction session with, in terms of saying, the whole aspect of resilience, and especially resilience, is we are beginning to understand now, whether it is population level resilience, whether it is system related resilience, etc. And it's a big issue with respect to the resilience themselves, which is sort of, if you want to transpose it, you can look at it in terms of vulnerabilities and resilience as well. And I think that's very, very critical in terms of looking at the pandemic. And where do we go from here? Probably is the next part of what I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamana. Thank you all for actually putting out so many different points over here. Each of them actually deserves probably a heated discussion. But Usha, would you like to sort of take this forward? I mean, I have a bunch of questions that sort of occurred to me, but I thought perhaps you can start on this. Would you like to?
Sure.
Okay.
So thanks everybody for your opening remarks. And I think there was some, resonance across the four of you, but also a few things that you highlighted separately. And if I could, I'd like to just start with the first one thing that really stuck out to me from what Murad said about two-way communication between journalists and scientists. And I'm wondering, what the journalists feel about this. I mean, do you think there was really two-way communication? Because I think what ended up happening from my perspective, and it's of course a very limited perspective, is that there was certain scientists and certain people who were working with data or, located in different fields of expertise who emerged as people who are willing to share information, willing to be critical about the information that was out there, willing to analyze in different ways, perhaps, what was going on. Similarly, there were some journalists who were willing to question, government data or publicly available data and train a more critical eye on it. But I think this was the exception. To my mind, it feels like this was the exception rather than the rule. So I'm wondering what, perhaps the journalists have to say about this perception of two-way communication.
I think from the government side, from the government side, they wouldn't take questions, or it was actually like pretty much one-sided from the government side and the government experts side. I mean, Banjot, again, Banjot would be missed, but yeah, she was covering it more regularly than I was, but there was no answers from anyone. It was very hard to communicate. Even if you go to the press conference, they may not answer questions. People had to be like, people had to be like stopped between lifts, and it was kind of nuts. And when the vaccine was approved, even that day it was very clearly told to us that we will just make a statement and we will not answer any questions. When they had said something so big that this is a vaccine in clinical mode, I can't remember the exact words now, but something like that. So you make such a big statement and you don't take any questions, it's ridiculous. So we had to all sit and guess what it means, and and there is no precedent. So yeah, I think between independent experts, there may have been more two-way communication, but definitely not the official experts or the official government officials, for sure, or people associated with the government. Yeah.
Right. So could I maybe ask Murad to just clarify then what you meant, and if you'd like to say something more on that.
I very much agree with what Menika is saying, or I believe it. I mean, and certainly that's my experience. That's the experience that I've gathered secondhand by talking to lots of journalists. So I should say that, when I say that there was really fruitful communication, it was two-way communication. I'm very much thinking within alternative media and with non-aligned experts. I mean, I suppose one thing which perhaps I didn't say clearly, but that the scientific establishment, if we want to call it that, was deeply compromised and played a very negative role throughout the pandemic. And I really kind of set that establishment aside when I'm talking about what I feel was kind of some positive aspects of this interaction. I'm really thinking amongst journalists who really wanted to probe the pandemic deeply and get to understand it deeply, and amongst a few people, a few scientists and other so-called experts who were also trying to understand what was unfolding in India. So for example, to give you an example, the story around mortality, which is still unfolding and is still complicated. We still have, of course, a lot of disagreements about what was the scale of pandemic mortality in India and how much of that can be ascribed directly to COVID-19 and how much indirectly to the pandemic. On the other hand, the uncertainties are far, far fewer than they were 2 years ago. So 2 years ago, when I was first, or maybe a little bit more than that, when I first started to write about mortality and to think about mortality and to ask why Indian data was kind of seeming strange or had a lot of internal contradictions within it. So if you look at different parts of the country, you see very different stories apparently unfolding. And what does this mean? And why does international data also hold so many kind of confusing aspects to it? There were some journalists who I felt engaged very deeply and very completely with these questions. And it was out of that process, I'm not saying just sparked by me, but by several other people who were interested in this question, that I think the process of unpacking the story of pandemic mortality in India has come. And it was a process which very much involved this interaction between scientists, demographers, and journalists. And journalists were the key. They did the RTIs, they went to state governments, they approached their contacts, and we got all the all-cause mortality data, which informs our understanding now. And that's just one example. There were several other points like that where I felt there was a fruitful interaction. But I suppose at the margins of mainstream journalism and government science, so not in that sphere.
So, may I intervene over here? Because I think Murad, you sort of raised the one issue sort of plaguing through the entire, all of the pandemic has been, who do we trust? Meaning, you spoke about non-aligned experts. Is there such a thing as a non-aligned expert? I'm asking that as a journalist, because finally, why should I trust, let's say you? You will have an analysis which I, as a, layperson, may or may not understand, and I have to at some point accept that what you say makes sense. At the same time, I will have another person who's equally, who I should have equal faith in, who has, who may be able to present it, who may present it differently. So I think that's certainly a dilemma that journalists have faced. And I don't know what you have to say to that. I think Menka and Sayantan will certainly have a comment to make, both as health writers and science writers, because my own feeling is it's not that clear cut. It's not just the government versus the scientists, the mainstream versus the alternative media. I think it's all mixed up over there. And I think that's one of the challenges for journalists to make some sense of it, to present it then to people like me, let's say. So maybe we can start with Menka and Sayantan and then get back to the two of you, the two experts here. Menka?
I don't write so much on data, so I'll give you that disclaimer, but I'm genuinely petrified of touching data because I feel that I will not get the correct story and I will not know who is fooling me. This is literally it. So I try to work on the issues that are not directly related to data, or if it's data, if it's something very simple, it's not something complicated. So yeah, for me also this is a problem, that who do I trust? Because even there are usually two sides, which there should not be ideally. and the other side would also be, say, equally qualified, right? I mean finally you look at some qualifications, right? And then it becomes very hard to sort of decipher who to trust, and you can just go by, okay, so and so people have raised so many questions and therefore are cynical and therefore probably can be trusted more. But yeah, that's about it. I mean, that's from it's very hard for people. Like, I mean, I think Rukmini, like, because she's been doing it for so many years, I think there is some sense of confidence, which, like, particularly in data, at least I find myself very shaky, and I find it hard to trust people also.
Okay.
So,
So yeah, can I? So I just want to. I mean, firstly, I completely resonate Menka's feeling of not trusting. I think I've chosen a field for myself where mistrust is the way to go, and one has to proceed with extreme skepticism. With anybody who claims expertise in anything. I mean, it's at least, and this is not just for the work that I've done while thinking about monkeypox and HIV/AIDS, not so much COVID, but also the general science writing work that I do is to really think about expertise itself as something that has to be questioned time and again. But what I also think is that the way to resolve this might not be to use the vocabulary of trust, but to think about what happens when you juxtapose these contradictory narratives. Sometimes these and they're not necessarily two narratives. There are several narratives that come up, and what happens when you juxtapose them in a report and let the synthesis happen in the reader's mind. I definitely think that readers are empowered enough to make sense of the different narratives that are presented to them. And different people will make sense of it different ways. And I think that different way of making sense is important in how conversations around public health proceed. And I think that's the approach that I've taken in my work. Of course, I'm happy to hear more about whether that's been effective or not. My sense is that Menka might add a little more to that in terms of just this juxtaposing narratives. But I want to think about, when one thinks about data, I think the worry for me primarily, and this is for the experts to also deliberate on, is the source where it's coming from, right? So you step into the field and then you ask, what does it look like? And you hear stories that just don't fit what expertise of any kind is telling us. And my worry is that how does that crosstalk happen? How do we take that story, which is emerging from the field, which is emerging from non-experts, which is emerging from commonsensical knowledge, ground observations, to people who are working in laboratories and fields of a different kind? And that's a question that I have been grappling with, and I can perhaps share some thoughts later.
Thanks.
I just want to flag one thing. I remember that the day the WHO data came out, in a very major newspaper, there was a huge article saying that, this data, I mean, more or less saying that it's exaggerated. With like many experts quotes, all of them were off record. So, this becomes for people who are not directly dealing with it. And I feel this increasingly with health reporting that, for you to report reasonably accurately, you are expected to know a lot, and which is sort of unfair also. You need to know a lot to be able to distinguish between, like, okay, acha, this is there. So then, like, to be able to ask those questions, etc., which is very unfair on a complete newbie, because, the experts are all coming with, I feel that a lot of experts come with a certain point of view, and, it becomes very hard to distinguish who is speaking from, which angle. And, those are the difficult questions. I feel that, like, I mean, it was a very surprising article, but it was quite distinct and, quite, I think these are the problems of health reporters now, that, you need to know, unfortunately, and I feel bad for newbies who start, you are expected to have like a very, I mean, the learning curve has to be really, it's very steep. So
can I add one example to sort of illustrate the kind of crosstalk problem that I was talking about? And this was something that came up when I was writing about monkeypox, right? I think in the early days when monkeypox was spoken about this year, and even probably continues till now, there's this constant narrative of it being largely restricted to a homosexual population, right? A population of homosexual men. That narrative continues till date. That narrative is the remnant of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, and I can speak a lot about its social implications. But whenever I spoke to people trying to understand, where do they stand in terms of saying, numbers coming from the WHO, and in fact, till today, the Center for Disease Control America's website on monkeypox demonstrates two apparently male-looking figures in their illustrations of how to, what to do if you are somebody who's sexually active. And then you see the kind of reduction that happens. So sexually active, gay men, therefore monkeypox must be a gay disease, etc. And that's a question of communication that we also must think about. But when one asks, okay, where are these numbers coming from? 97% of people who have been affected by monkeypox, or the reported cases of monkeypox, have come from people who identify as queer. I think what several experts failed to identify is the kind of health consciousness that a lot of urban queer men have, which is largely where the numbers are coming from. Thanks to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, many queer men, gay men particularly, go for regular testing, STD testing, and it is in these STD panels that monkeypox was also being identified. So this kind of consciousness does not get captured in communication with just experts. So then the point is, how does that crosstalk happen, right? So you understand that the community, let's say, of gay men is able to get themselves diagnosed because they have sort of had that transgenerational experience with HIV/AIDS, have a kind of public health system, and have a health consciousness that sort of forces them to approach the healthcare system more frequently than others. How does that inform the insight of experts? That's the question that I'm grappling with.
Maybe Shamanna has something to say on this.
I want to draw a distinction with the source of communication with a country like the UK did. If you looked at it, in terms of regular communications, which used to happen on a daily basis, and Murad can probably correct me on this. You had the health secretary flanked by the chief medical officer, and also somebody like Peter Valence or Chris Whitty, etc., doing the communication, and all the journalists were probably getting their information right from the horse's mouth, if you wanted to ask me. We didn't have such sort of a system with respect to communicating information on a regular basis. And what we had was somebody like a joint secretary who happened to be a technocrat. And it was very difficult to get things out of these people in terms of the information. Even the numbers, etc. There was so much of discrepancy in terms of the numbers which we got. So I somehow liked the model which the UK had set up in terms of communicating, and especially the sources of communication from which journalists got it was excellent, I thought. Murad, do you want to add a little more than that?
Well, I was in India for most of that period of the pandemic until mid-2021, so I wasn't following those daily briefings. But one thing I can tell you about the UK is that, first of all, you have what you could call a data establishment, which is fairly independent of direct governmental control. So you have something called the Office for National Statistics, which gathers data and which is not under direct political control. And so it can actually gather meaningful data, and it can release this data. It may not always get things right. It may misinterpret, there may be some misinterpretation, but we don't have direct political interference in that. And the second thing that's worth mentioning about the UK is, aside from the government panel of experts, you also had an independent panel of experts. And this independent panel of experts was highly influential throughout the pandemic. It's called Independent SAGE, it was called. And in a sense, it kept the government experts on their toes because, it kind of kept a constant public dialogue about each piece of data, each piece of information that was emerging. So it wasn't just that you had a more reliable official information. You also had an unofficial body, if you like, which was composed of people who really attempted to understand the disease very well and had expertise in lots of different things, and which was kind of moderating the discussion, if you like, and kind of keeping it sane. But I want to go back to a couple of other things which have been raised, really interesting points. So I think Sayanthan's point about that, I think his example, their example of what happened in the monkeypox epidemic and how it was being described, and then what was happening on the ground, and then what official information was saying was a really useful example. Because if you go back to the question of who do you trust, I think there isn't an automatic answer to that. If you're a journalist, who can you trust? People are giving you different stories. Which of these stories might be meaningful? Which of these stories can be trusted? But what you can do is you can try to develop a relationship. And most of the meaningful interactions happen through this relationship, where you say, okay, so this is what the data is saying, but this is what I am seeing on the ground. This is what's happening within the community from which this data is emerging. So for example, in the case of COVID, there are people who are unable to get tested. So what should we make of all this positive tests data? I mean, is it fair data? Is it biased data, given that there are so many people, and in some communities, pretty much everyone is unable to get tested? So obviously, then you have to question that data. And it's through that two-way interaction. So for example, you talk to journalists about what all-cause mortality data is and how that might shed a light on the mortality story of the pandemic. And the journalists themselves are then perhaps able to get hold of this all-cause mortality data. And it's through that process that trust develops. So I don't think you can a priori say, okay, we distrust the government experts and we trust the independent experts or anything like that. But if you can develop that relationship, and that's what good health reporting really should be about, at least partly, I feel, then you come to a point where you are able to kind of unpack the story, I think, with a little bit more confidence. I don't think it can come out of an a priori view of who is trustworthy and who is not.
I also, if I may, Sandhya, just come back to a point, in the history timeline that Shamana mentioned between January and March. And I'm wondering if, there was a failure on the part of those responsible, let's say, for creating awareness, for doing homework. I mean, that time could have been used in multiple ways. And I'm wondering if that period, you see that gap as, a loss of opportunity in some way, because it was suddenly in March when, we plunged headlong into crisis, whereas the world had already, in many other countries, we already saw what was happening, both the failures and the coping mechanisms. So can you say something about that?
Usha, a couple of things. I think one was that you also knew what was happening in other parts of the world, and which probably is a reflection of what would happen in our thing. You also had the experience of 100 years ago in terms of the 1918, 1919 Spanish flu pandemic as well. And even there, if you looked at it, it was not the first attack, or if you don't want to call it the wave, which was not as serious as it was. But we definitely knew that the second wave, which happened during that time, was equally bad. And the more number of deaths happened during that second wave, and which we could have anticipated very much within our system as well. I think if you talk of lost opportunities, I think we had many opportunities which we missed, I guess. In terms of preparedness, yes, I think we could have put in place a little more allaying apprehensions, communication, and trying to look at, at least a response in terms of the system itself, which did not happen, unfortunately.
Sandhya, do we want to call for questions from the floor? Because I know that there was a hand up, I think Mr.
Okay, I missed that. I haven't seen that, but
yeah. So if anybody would like to raise a hand and ask a question of any of the panelists, if you could just keep it brief. And yes, Mr. Venkata Jagannathan, would you like to unmute and ask your question? Yes, sir, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. I have been hearing to all these discussions and these conversations. There are a few points which I still feel some of them which can be added, like, the origin of the virus, which nobody want to touch. Because whether any investigative journalism will help in this case, or whether there is how to put this, because it's a more complicated question. It requires inputs both from scientists and as well as from journalists. And without a collaboration, that won't come out. Point two, which I want to say is this, regarding the third booster dose, somebody was talking. This third booster dose, we have discussed several times in some of the TV debates and other things, particularly to communicate it to the public. Because I am a scientist, first, let me tell, I am a scientist from life sciences. So what we have said, first 2 doses itself are sufficient in most of the cases. The reason here why I said third dose is not is an optional only in the case of only those senior citizens or those who have comorbidities. Why it is so is those who have sufficient immunity in their bodies. First 2 doses are sufficient to create sufficient immunity to the body. When the virus again infects, the virus recognizes, even with the virus recognizes, there are some other system within the biological system, which is called an immune system, like B cells and T cells. These cells will respond in response to the attack from the virus. So therefore, third dose, is it really required or not, is a big debatable point even in the scientific circles, and to whom it is required. So that is why it is very cautiously, it was told that take the advice from the director, then only go for a booster dose. Don't go in a panic way for a booster dose. This is not a booster dose actually, that also people have mentioned in between. This is a third dose. Second dose, first self is the primer dose, second dose is the booster dose. This is again additional dose, which is generally not required. And as far as India's situation is concerned, the third point which I want to make, India has by and large made extremely well as far as handling the corona virus is concerned. Particularly, just 1 minute, my battery is closing, just I will switch on and then talk. Particularly in the vaccination, our scientists have come out in time with the proper synthesis of the vaccines and proper preparation of vaccines and tests, and also government freely distributing to all the population. And this really has protected the country like anything. And the lockdowns, timely lockdowns, and when releasing the lockdowns in a systematic fashion, these has really protected the people to a great extent. But where we have missed in the second wave, there were some problems, which is very unexpected, and nobody expected that mutant that it will attack the people. So that is where there was a little panicky, both from scientific circles but scientific circles knows that these mutants are natural, because mutants keep occurring in this particular virus, in this kind of a virus. But only thing is the nature of mutation, and whether it is really such a harsh or not is something that cannot be predictable. These are the points that I want to make here.
Yeah, thanks very much for your points. And, I think they're a particular perspective and they're valid. But, what we'd like to deliberate on here is not so much the decisions themselves or the science of the virus, but how we either failed or succeeded in communicating both risk and, the implications of facing those risks. So whether those were
what I felt, from this point of view, the gap what I felt, when 29th December the virus was reported first time, and the reactions in Italy and China and other places have been seen, those things would have been properly, told to the people in advance. that would have been, minimizing some problem. Instead of doing that, where we have, particularly, I don't want to blame journalists because this is more of a scientific point also involved in this. So if this is reported properly, people would have become more alert than before. That's the only point. That's what I felt. And other successive waves also, the response from US, where there are a lot of deaths, the model they have followed for, preventing that, or, protecting their population from that. So some of the models have created some problems, and those would have been highlighted before because they occurred in advance to our country. Because our country is in the second time, when it is all world is exposed to the Western world, we have 3 months gap. We have a 3 months gap between the other countries. These 3 months gap would have been utilized properly. Other than that, I did not see much problem. Otherwise, reporting, I felt is reasonably okay. Of course, you are the people who can judge from the reporting point of view. Yeah.
Would any of you like to respond to that? Either Menaka or Shayantan?
My only very brief response is that it is not so much about alertness of the people as much as it is about the alertness of the government and the public health system structures that also had the same amount of time and the same observations that Mr. Venkata Jagannathan is talking about. So for me, as a journalist who was observing the phenomena unfolding, it was a reminder of the several other pandemics that this country has seen before. There's really, the distinctions, if you look at how the public health system is prepared to deal with spikes in an emergency, as I've been calling it, it's always been poor. It's just been, it's always failed us. It's just that the populations that it has failed have been previously extremely marginalized. COVID is one example where, because the virus is in the air, quote unquote, it's affected a lot of people who have otherwise been insulated from death and disease. And, so therefore the public health system has never bothered as much to be prepared. So I definitely see this as a question of, it as a social and political question, because HIV/AIDS is, I keep on going back to it simply because we have more documented records from the HIV/AIDS pandemic, but tuberculosis, malaria, dengue, HIV/AIDS, any kind of women's health crises that have happened in the past, I think our public health infrastructure has always, and the government has always failed us. It's always led to more death and disease. It has always had experience from other countries to study and prepare itself, and it's never done it.
So focus, of course, I don't want to extend too much. I want to last this one. Is there any post-pandemic reporting? Because this pandemic, I say, has not yet ended. It is still going on, and nobody knows when another wave will come. So from that point of view, post-pandemic, are you trying to sensitize the public, or through your writings or other things, or through journalism? What is the role that you people can play in a more effective way is now appears to be a more important point. That's what, this is my last final comment here.
I think this is something that Menaka also mentioned in her talk. And maybe I can just add to this another question that was in the chat from Sachin. The COVID crisis has led to other crises such as human conflicts, psychological issues, economy and businesses were affected. Could there be a way to collect data and track the chain of events and other crises it led to? Now, of course, there's within this a direct determination between COVID and other crises, which perhaps it's not so straightforward. These are existing crises which were complicated further by the COVID pandemic. But yes, would any of you like to take that question?
In general, I also, this is a general rule and not related to COVID or anything. I think journalists should not feel compelled to give any kind of report card on any sort of government. It's not our job to do that. We can, I mean, in fact, it's a better idea, in fact, to look for flaws. Then that doesn't mean that the entire structure is bad, or but it's important for people to know what the flaws of a certain system are. So it's not our job to give a report card. I mean, that's probably the job of, I think, people like Dr. Shaman or someone, but it's definitely not our job to, give like an overall So I mean, if that entire framework only is not acceptable to me, so there is no point in going there, for so even if the government has done really well, I'll have to, there are like probably 100 things that would anyway go wrong. So we have to be able to point out flaws, rather than saying ki, acha, but still the government did well. So that's not our job anyway. So I just want to put that out there.
Yeah, Shyam, do you want to jump in there? Since your name was mentioned.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to what Mr. Jagannathan said and then Menaka said, but I'll probably agree with Menaka, but what Mr. Jagannathan said, I personally think even today, a lot of us do not understand the paradox in terms of why death occurs in COVID. The COVID pneumonia is more of an inflammatory reaction or an autoimmune reaction, and that is why we get pneumonia and people die. On the other hand, you give vaccination to boost people's immunity. Death is because of your body tissue recognizing your own, sort of body tissue as being foreign and reacts to it. And that is why we get pneumonia and people die because of pneumonia, because of the interface with respect to not having enough oxygen. And that is where, in terms of really, I was making this distinction between booster and precautionary. Even today, I think it's very important to understand, if you've had 2 doses of vaccine and had probably a COVID infection after that, that's the best sort of immunity you would ever get, rather than depending upon a vaccine. And this whole precautionary dose business is more in terms of preventing newer variants, which could probably cause COVID. And I debunked this idea in terms of the 3rd dose or precautionary dose completely. And I wanted to make this distinction with respect to deaths because of COVID is not because of the infection per se, but it is because of the reaction or the inflammation to something which has occurred previously. And that is why you see deaths later in life or later in the course of the disease rather than early.
So I just wanted to come back to one point that Menaka kind of alluded to, in terms of young journalists, needing to know so much more nowadays to cover crises like this. And I'm wondering, we are talking about, what are the ethics of reporting? How does one cover such issues ethically, and so on? So it seems to me that this should not be the responsibility of an individual journalist who's coming into the space, but it's the responsibility of the media establishment to create conditions where journalists can learn and not learn under pressure, as they've had to in the COVID pandemic, right? So maybe, it's more about the ethics of the journalism establishment rather than the ethics of practice per se. And I'm wondering if, in your experience, and perhaps, Sayantan also can speak to this, what are the conditions that can be created by media houses to facilitate this kind of reporting?
If I say training, I can confidently say that nobody's going to sit for a training or pay attention to it. But I think to have like some sort of mentoring system, maybe, like the problem, actually, the bigger problem is that the senior reporters are not retained in any sort of major media house. So it's a very systemic sort of issue. Like, you will not see senior reporters in health reporters are usually the youngest ones. And even the senior reporters who are there are mostly covering ministry, which means they're not covering science and public health as such, which is sort of more, it's sort of more nuanced than covering, like, say, a ministry announcement or a ministry sort of, because it has its own internal politics. It's a bit like covering politics, actually. So I think it's also to keep those older journalists in your, or, at least have like a expert journalist who can like sort of guide you, something like that. Because from what I know is that I have only learned under crisis. Like, anything that happens, it's usually like, oh, this has happened and you have to go cover it. So it's a lot of responsibility on the young reporter. And if the young reporter is, say, like covering crime or something the previous day and suddenly sent to a hospital, it's a bit you're right. It's mostly on the media houses. And as we were discussing before this started, that a lot of journalists were also sent to hospitals that time, and when they were actually reluctant to. And people like me who are freelancers, we don't have enough support to go out and report. Even if we do, it's all on us basically. So you have to be like very brave basically. Like, I don't know whether a journalist's job is, like, unless they're covering war or something, is it their job to be that brave, considering we didn't know so much that time, like in the beginning of the pandemic. So I think I agree with you that it's on the media house, but it's also a structural issue that we don't retain the senior people who can say, Arey, like, you're not supposed to do this, or you're not supposed to take the story, or you're not supposed to present it this way. I think that is also missing. Someone who questions but as Murad was also saying that a lot of health reporting is, he was talking about building a relationship and all that. But a newspaper, or a a daily website or anything, you have to be able to produce something on a daily basis, and that relationship may develop, but your first few stories at least will not reflect that. So that is always a risk. So that issue remains.
So I think sorry,
go ahead, Murad.
Yeah. So I just wanted to add to this because Menka spoke about freelancers, and I'm also one. I think and I think that's why, like Murad said, alternative media perhaps did better in terms of health reporting, is because at least my sense is that many of us who've come to journalism after doing something else in our lives, like I have a degree in neurosciences and now doing journalism the way I am, I think we've been able to sort of fit into this lacuna of training, as we are calling. It is unfortunate. It shouldn't be one shouldn't require a neuroscience degree or a science degree even to write about health and science, because it doesn't concern just people who have science degrees. But I think because a lot of alternative media works with freelancers is why alternative media perhaps did better, because then they could identify people with the sufficient background knowledge. But like, I mean, I unfortunately don't have a response to what will make the situation better. I mean, I haven't worked with media houses enough to understand the internal politics. And B, I'm generally scared of making blanket statements. I agree with Menka that I don't think anybody is going to sit through training. I think I agree there. So yeah, I can only point out problems rather than, I mean, I have no solution to offer at this moment.
Maybe I could just add a few words.
Yeah, and actually, Murad, before you start, if I could just add this question to to what you're going to say. Sachin has asked again, are there any public repositories that we can access of data, and how does one, how reliable are they? So if you're able to also address that.
I'll try to address both of those questions. First of all, coming to the question, I mean, being outside, so as an outsider to journalism, but looking in, it's always struck me that in some cases, at least, you manage to have, fabulous journalists writing very amazing stories on a subject actually with very little specialist knowledge. And the question is, how is that possible? And for me, I think the reason that's possible is usually because there's a framework which they have developed for how to treat precisely, perhaps you could say, their ignorance of the subject, for how to treat. So if I were to suddenly be asked to investigate a subject which I know nothing about or know very little about, I would call on maybe a more broad set of principles. And of course, one of those principles would be a certain skepticism. So if I go speak to experts or government voices, I would be cautious about what they would say. I would have a set of questions that would be almost generic in some sense, like, where does this data come from? Who gathered it? What is the process by which it was gathered? How reliable is it? I wouldn't necessarily know whether to trust the answers, but at least I think I would try to develop a set of questions. And I think if you were looking in from the outside, like me, then I think what you would say is that's the set of questions which is more important in some ways than the specialist knowledge. Of course, specialist knowledge helps because then that helps you to ask the detailed questions you need to ask. But there are still guidelines, perhaps, that you can follow when investigating something that is so complex. And the pandemic, like I said at the start, is on the extreme end of complexity, as I feel, of in terms of being an event, a scientific event, a social event, a kind of humanitarian event, and a political event all in one, with so many different facets to it. That's just a general observation. In terms of public repositories of data, I think the question was, are there repositories of mortality data? The answer is there are, but unfortunately, I wouldn't say that there's any one repository which draws together all the available all-cause mortality data, which says what happened in India during the pandemic. Some of this data has been obtained through RTIs. Some of it is incomplete. It comes from online systems which only record some deaths, but not all deaths. Some of it comes from official state government data. So in that sense, it's reliable in the sense of at least being official and rubber stamped by state governments. So it's a real mixture of different kinds of data. Yes, there are repositories. And in fact, you'll find them in the kind of appendices. You'll find references to these repositories in the appendices of any of the mortality studies. And now there are many mortality studies which look at pandemic mortality in India, including my own with Ashish Gupta. So the data is there, but it's very incomplete. It's not going to tell a full story, and it does require quite a lot of work to interpret, is how I would respond to that in terms of mortality data, at least.
So Usha, may I just jump in right now with a couple of points which you can take forward then? Yeah. So I was just trying to identify what I thought at least I hate the word takeaway, but I would say takeaways from this. And before I say that, I just want to respond to Amar's comment. Actually, health journalism didn't start with COVID. Health journalism has developed over the last 15 years at least. It's got a lot of support, a lot of funding. The challenges remain, but and COVID, I think, presented new challenges, both physically and technically. I just want to make three themes. One is just the notion of communicating uncertainty, as Murad pointed out. I wanted to add to that, there were shifting messages with which Dr. Shamana also pointed out, the notion of a vaccine dose gap, boosters, precautionary doses, and our trusted scientists, not only of not only the government, otherwise also gave very, very mixed messages or changing messages. So one question is a question of how do you communicate uncertainty? Because that was certainly there. We assume uncertainty and not malintention that result in that problem. Second point is that journalists are not just communicators. In fact, this is not about communication. This is about journalism, holding the government accountable, holding scientists accountable for their words. And we should not, as Menka pointed out, do not concur too much of the government. Be skeptical about both government and scientists. So the role of government is communicators. The third point that Murad made, I think, and actually everyone made this point, which is the ethics of communication. Are you telling the whole story? Is there a side of the story that I've not accessed? I get this data. Do I know how it's been collected? Who is counted? Who is not collected? Who is not counted? Marginalization. I mean, is my reporting, does it include caste, religion, gender identity, class, other marginalization? I mean, that's the ethics of communication. Is that part of my thinking all the time as a journalist? And finally, just respond to Sanjay Nagral's comment, which is, I think I'm just throwing it out there because it's not something that's really been discussed over here, but there was a kind of collaboration between journalists and medical professionals. For example, journalists get access into an ICU to get a story. There's a question about, was it necessary? Was it good for the story? Was it important for the story? Or was it important to the, let's say, the hospital, which gave access to the ICU? I'm just putting those points out there. Communication, role of journalists, ethics of communication. To me, these are the three themes that came out in this very kind of varied discussion. Usha, would you want to sort of take it forward and make it a little bit more together better than I did? Yeah.
No, I think you summed it up very well. And I see we're already past the 7:30 mark, so we should probably wrap up. And I know that there are many questions that we can pursue even further. And there is this sort of overlap, right, between the public communication role of those who manage the information and the decision making and the data that informs that decision making, and on the other side, those who communicate that to the public either through journalism or other forms of explanation, documentation. And I think during the pandemic, we looked to journalists actually to perform that dual role. I mean, they were both explaining and they were critiquing. And that was quite a challenge, right? I mean, those were many skill sets that they had to develop. And then if you put that within the framework of ethics, I think ethics often, maybe not just in India, but everywhere, tends to be an afterthought. And it's only in retrospect that we see that something was left out, or certain sensitivities were not taken into account, as you mentioned, Sandhya. So I think there are many complex issues that we have to think about. But what I really liked was Murad summing up of, what are the questions we need to ask? What are the frameworks we need to have in mind when we approach a complex issue like the pandemic? And I would say, in addition to having those informational frameworks, or the frameworks that lead us to look at information, I think we need to add this layer of ethical decision-making, ethical consideration of whatever stories we're trying to tell. So I think we really have to stop now. And thanks to all the panelists. What we're hoping to do is, take the points made here and see if we can develop some kind of a white paper that will put down some how-tos, some things that we can think about going forward. We do have a second webinar coming up on the 13th, and it would be great if some of you or all of you could join us there, because I think many of the conversations that we began here today will continue in that panel. And we do have people who are on the side of science, as well as policymakers and public communicators on that panel. So thanks to all the panelists, Minka, Shayantan, Murad, and Shamana for being here. And a big thank you to the FMES team for managing the technology and making sure it didn't break down. So yeah, that's my final word. And I just wanted to say that there are some really interesting questions and comments in the chat that we couldn't take up, but something to think about. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.